Welcome, everyone. Thank you for trekking out. Today is better, relatively, than yesterday, yes? All right. It's my pleasure to introduce Dean Kara Gardner, Associate Dean of the Faculty and Acting Head of the Arts and Humanities at Minerva Schools. We invited Dean Gardner to campus today to take part in a panel discussion in Vice Chancellor Ian Waits and Professor Maria Yang's Designing the First Year Experience class. And we just couldn't pass up the opportunity to also ask her to do a seminar for the Teaching and Learning Lab. We know that the Minerva model is very intriguing and inspiring, and we wanted her to have the opportunity to share that with us today. Dean Gardner joined the Minerva Schools in the fall of 2013, 1 year prior to the start of the first class. So she has seen this young university evolve over time. And she was telling me that while things have evolved, of course, they've still held true to the values and the guiding principles that they established at the outset. So you'll be hearing about those today. Dean Gardner is a musicologist who earned her Ph.D. in music and humanities from Stanford University. She taught then for 4 years as a postdoctoral fellow in Stanford's Introduction to the Humanities program. She also taught at the University of San Francisco for more than 10 years, where she designed and led classes on popular music, music of the Americas, music appreciation, and music and gender. Dean Gardner told me that the main reason she got her PhD is because she wanted to teach. And then she was surprised to find that faculty weren't actually instructed in how to teach. They were just expected to do it. But she must have done a pretty good job at teaching herself along the way, because not only has she received teaching awards, she now works for a university that really thinks very deeply about their pedagogy. I was introduced to Dean Gardner by friend and colleague Lucas Tambasco. Some of you in the audience probably know Lucas. He recently received his PhD in math at MIT and is now on the faculty at Minerva. While here, I have to put in the shameless plug, while here at MIT, Lucas participated in TLL's teaching certificate program. He has always had a passion for teaching. And Dean Gardner tells me that Lucas is exactly the type of faculty member they look for at Minerva, someone who is a scholar in their field and also knowledgeable about and dedicated to teaching. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dean Gardner. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you, Deepa, for that really lovely introduction. And Lucas was teaching class on his way over here at the very end of class. It was wrapping up, so that's one of the benefits of Minerva is that you can take your classroom with you wherever you go. So today I want to leave a lot of time for questions. We do active learning, fully active learning at Minerva, which I'll talk about. So having this kind of being on the podium is uncomfortable for me a little bit. I like to interact a lot with the group. Can you guys raise your hand if you, obviously everyone's heard of Minerva. Raise your hand if you know a bit about Minerva. Everybody here, wow, this is great. Okay, so maybe you can give me one thing you know about Minerva. Maybe this young woman, I don't know, did you raise your hand? Yeah.
Well, pretty much what Deepa already said, that you're very innovative in your pedagogy, that you're trying to bring technology to the classroom, and at the same time sort of look at the traditional values of teaching, I suppose.
Great. Yeah, and maybe I'll ask this man behind you, what are you hoping to learn from our discussion today?
I want to hear more about the experiential learning aspect of it and how it's incorporated into the teaching.
Okay, great. So I'm going to get into that and on a number of other things. So I'm going to focus on some major themes as I go through the slides here. Main things are, why did we start Minerva? Just as I've been there since the beginning, what was the impetus for starting this new model? What are some of the problems in higher education that we're trying to address? And how are we addressing them? So meaning, what do we teach and how do we teach it? And then a little bit about the model in terms of the student experience across the globe. So those are going to be the main topics. I will show a video that will demonstrate our Minerva forum, and then we'll have questions. Okay. So in terms of the why we started Minerva, you can see here from this slide, we're drowning information. This is kind of the challenge that we face in the 21st century. Lots of information out there, lots of access to information, which is different from the educational models of the past. more distant past where, you know, giving access to information was a part of the goal. Now there's just so much information available at the fingertips. How do we process it? How do we synthesize it? How do we think about it critically? So that's one of the challenges that we face now in the 21st century. Also technology. Lots of changes in technology. I'm sure this is something you thought about a lot being at MIT. So technological advances, big data, automation, this is going to really transform the workforce. So they say 27 million current job roles, as many as 75 million job roles displaced and changing because of these technological advancements. 133 million new job roles, as many as those may emerge by 2022. So this is not the distant future. This is pretty much now, right? So how do we prepare students for that? And are students being prepared for that? Also, globalization, right? So we're becoming more and more of a global economy. 65% of companies with more than 10 billion in annual revenues have programs for recruiting diverse talent. Speaking with our professional development team, a lot of times students don't know about those opportunities, so we try to connect the dots there, link students with these opportunities. But becoming more global, companies are becoming more global in their workforces, and we're all tied together globally. And so we want to equip students with adaptable skills, enable them to succeed and affect positive change in the world in order to kind of meet these new changing demands in the workplace and then beyond too, just even in the day-to-day life, right? But in many ways, there are some systemic issues in the educational system in higher ed today that make it difficult to kind of meet those goals and meet those challenges for the future. So I'm just going to go through some of those. In many ways, we're not really preparing our students very well for the future, right? So higher education is not really meeting, the promises we think we're meeting. So you can see the statistic, 96% of chief academic officers think their institutions are effectively preparing students. 11% of employers agree with that. So most employers do feel that the students are coming in not really prepared to engage in the things they need to engage in, to think in the ways they need to think. And so they don't have the tools necessary to be effective in the workplace when they graduate. And this is undergraduates, right? So after the 4 years of undergraduate degree. And about half of the students who enroll in university don't complete their degrees. So we have a retention problem. Even if this is 55% of US students graduate in 6 years or under, so they can't make it in 4 years. It takes them 6, and only 55% graduate in 6. And even after they graduate, they often don't absorb the content. So one of the things that we talk a lot about in our faculty training is the difference between lectures and active learning. And in lectures, you actually forget a lot of what you learn very quickly. So unless you're actually applying it actively, you forget what you've learned. Even if you're studying and you're doing well on the tests and you're passing your classes with high grades, you don't retain much of the content that you take away. It fades very quickly. And also affordability, right? So people are leaving their 4 years of study with enormous debt. About a little over $30,000 in debt is the average amount US students will owe, and that was in 2016. I imagine it's probably gone up. And this does impose kind of broad costs across the board on society, so not just the individual paying, but having to take loans, defaulting on loans, those kinds of issues are really widespread, as I'm sure all of you know and have thought about. And another thing is access. So there are many, many international students who want to study in the United States. Very hard for them to be admitted to the top universities. So you can see this, less than 1% of students admitted to Harvard are Chinese, like from China, which does not begin to reflect the number of qualified students in China, just China alone, right, who wish to study there. And that's a statistic from Harvard, right? So access for international students is very limited here in the United States as well. And so in order to address these problems, we need to rethink how and what we teach, and always keep in mind who teaching is for, which is the students, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've designed our pedagogy and what we feel is a better way to learn. So first of all, as I mentioned, active learning is superior to lectures in terms of promoting comprehension and memory. How many of you do active learning in your classes? Okay, so Ben, since we met already, can you give me an example of active learning that you might use, an active learning technique?
So my classes usually feature a lot of discussion when I'm teaching music. And instead of me just telling them what I think is the appropriate way to read or understand a piece of music, I try to set up debates between the students where they present their different positions and try to defend their arguments based on history, their experience, or what's in the score.
Great. Debates are a really good active learning technique because it engages both the debater and the listener, right? Because the listeners have to think, well, which side am I on? And let's talk about that afterwards. And I promise I didn't plant a fellow music professor in the audience. We just met right before. Great. Okay, so fully active learning hinges on discussion, activities, exercises that require students to be continuously engaged. And when we say continuously engaged, that means even if they're not speaking, they're also thinking about something, right? So we give them, when I used to teach music, actually this would be a technique I would use. You know, I would say, okay, we're going to listen to a long piece of music. That's pretty challenging for younger and younger people, I've noticed. I taught a course where I had people over 40, and they came to me after about 2 lessons and they said, can you play longer clips of the music? Because you're cutting them off way too quickly. Because I was used to my undergraduates who like 3 minutes is about what they can, and even after about 1.5 minutes, I could see the attention beginning to wane. And so I would say to them, okay, this group you're going to listen to the violins, and this group you're going to listen to the flutes, and this group's listening to the percussion. And when we're done listening, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how those 3 components interact in the piece. That's an example of active listening. So we do a lot of active listening when we're in our classes. If you're listening to a debate, you're choosing a side. You maybe are going to have to rebut. You don't know if you're going to get called on. Those are ways that we engage the listener as well as the speaker. So through a combination of theory and practice, our students learn broadly applicable skills. Those skills are introduced in our Cornerstone courses in the first year. So we have 4 Cornerstone courses in the first year. Every student, and they're year-long courses, all of our students enroll in those. So they all get that same backbone, and then the courses build on those throughout the 4 years. And what they get are our habits of mind and foundational concepts in the first year. I know that was mentioned in the flyer. Our HCs, as we call them. Those are introduced in our Cornerstone courses, and then we use those skills and continue to measure those skills, which is really important. So we don't just ask them to use those habits of mind and foundational concepts. We actually assess them on those using rubrics throughout the 4 years of study. And the goal of those HCs is to get at these higher level core competencies. So personal skills, right? Critical thinking, and critical thinking is broken down into a number of components. So evaluating claims and justifications, analyzing data, decisions and problems. That is mainly focused on in our formal analyses course, although we do actually transfer these skills across our courses even in the first year. Creative thinking, facilitating discovery, applying research methods and solving problems. That one we cover primarily in empirical analyses. And then interpersonal skills, so effective communication, using language and nonverbal communication techniques. We focus on those in our multimodal communications course. And then effective interaction, so interacting within complex systems, negotiating and persuading, working with others, addressing ethical problems. That one we focus on in our complex systems course. So again, all of our first year students come in, they take these 4 courses, that's all they do in their first year academically is those 4 courses, which gives them also a shared language that they continue to use. And they do use them. Their HCs are things they talk about all the time. Like I see them in the kitchen at our headquarters when they're interning, and they'll be talking about an HC, and I'm like, are you doing this for my benefit, or are you really talking about the? No, we swear, we talk about them all the time. So it's really exciting to see that. And not something I expected, that like in their regular day-to-day, they would actually use those those hashtags and that vocabulary that they obtain in the first year. And it's really exciting to see. So an example of a habit of mind, right? These are cognitive skills that are triggered automatically, so it becomes very automatic. So things like characterizing the nature of the problem, right? You start to think, okay, we need to define the problem. Like that's an immediate kind of, you leap to that as you get into a situation where you're trying to solve a problem. Make sure it's clearly defined. Identify audiences and tailor messages accordingly. So when I'm up here speaking, I ask Deepa, who's going to be there? And what is their background? How much they know about Minerva before I come and speak? And that should be an automatic trigger that you do that before you get in front of an audience or before you write something. And then use effective strategies to teach yourself new materials. So we actually do teach the students how to obtain new information and teach themselves. We often say we teach them how to fish, right? So rather than giving them the information, we teach them how to get it for themselves. And then foundational concepts. This is fundamental knowledge that you can build on, and it's broadly applicable. So distinguishing correlation from causation. That's not such an automatic trigger to do, but you learn that that's a really important foundational piece of knowledge to use in many contexts. Or identify and compensate for biases. It's complex to do that, right? So we know that we should do it, but it actually takes a lot of processing and conscious thought to do that. Identify ways that multiple causes interact in complex systems. That's one that I think about a lot now, having seen the complex systems curriculum that I hadn't thought about before I came to Minerva, for example. But these are deeper concepts that take more time to master, and again, the more you see them in different contexts, the more you get familiar and deeper knowledge. Okay, and we focus on how to help students transfer the practical knowledge to new contexts, including contexts that appear very different on the surface. So it might not be obvious, the similarities between these two different contexts where they're applying something. And so that's something that the students are meant to become more adept at, is how to transfer this information across different environments. So different fields of study, right? So you might, if I go back to identify and compensate for biases, I mean, can somebody give me an example of where they might use that fundamental concept? Shall I call on someone? Let's see, everyone's like, oh, Lucas, maybe I'll call on you just because I know you. That's right. Okay, so you're watching the news, you're thinking there's a pundit up there. Where is this person coming from? What is their background? What is their agenda? Like, there's a lot of things behind that you might be thinking about. I see nodding here. So can you give me another example that's really different from that context where you might have to identify a bias?
We frequently identify biases when we're doing any kind of hiring or admissions.
Yeah, great. And that's thinking about your own bias, right? If you're an evaluator, for example. So being really conscious of that, and I think becoming conscious that we have bias and what our biases are is really critical in order to make better decisions about things. Yeah, so those are two really different contexts, but both using the same foundational information and knowledge, right? Great, okay. So this is just a kind of an overall map of how our curriculum looks. You can see that we have 5 colleges. We have 5 majors. The majors are really broad, so arts and humanities, computational sciences, natural sciences, rather than music or math or biology, right? So they're really broad majors. We have 3 core courses in each major in the second year. So if you decide to major in arts and humanities, you take a course in history, a course in philosophy, and a course in arts and literature and how those operate within society. So you still have a fairly broad exposure in the second year. It's still cross-disciplinary, like those courses are, preparing the students to understand what it is to be a humanist. And then going up these courses that you see here on this map or these concentrations you see are a little more similar to what you might see in a traditional major. So except that it's, analyzing the humanities, contextualizing the humanities, those are more approaching skills-based, right? Like analyzing the humanities is going to be more like what a music theorist might do, where you're taking analytical tools or you're taking literary criticism and you're looking at different ways of understanding multiple kinds of literature as opposed to like English literature as a focus. So I would say they're still fairly broad in terms of thinking about the tools you need for that particular field. And I go to the humanities because that's my comfort zone. But it's true of all the others as well. Okay, so getting into the technology. We could not do our classes if we did not have the Active Learning Forum. I think this is a tool that we capitalize on in order to get at the fully active learning in ways that we couldn't do in a traditional brick and mortar classroom. Okay, so technology offers us the ability to create a more controlled and dynamic setting than a traditional classroom. We have students all on video. They each have their own video stream. It's synchronous, so these are live classes. They're small. We have about 18 students in a class or smaller. I think you had like 9 or 10 in there, maybe even smaller. Oh, all of your classes are full, yeah. Oh, some of them had left by the time I saw them then at the end, at the end of class. But yeah, so some are really big, 18. Some of the classes that you get when you get into their 3rd and 4th years and they're concentrating, they can narrow down and maybe be a little bit smaller. But average class size is probably somewhere in the 15 range. And then breakout groups. So we do breakout groups that allow for small class interaction. How many of you guys do small group work in your classes? Pretty common. How long does it take to get into the, now you can answer. You got saved by your colleague in front of you here. So how long does it take you to get into a breakout when you're in a physical classroom, like a small group?
Well, it requires a couple of minutes to
Yes.
learn that, and then later in the semester it is better.
Yeah, that's true. You can facilitate it faster because maybe they know which group to go to or where to go in the room. But there is this like, okay, let me count off. You're in group 1, you're in group 2, you're in group 3. Okay, you go over there, you go over there. So that takes time. And also, it's hard to listen in. I can remember teaching, and here I come walking over to the group to listen what they're talking about, and all of a sudden, they stop talking, right? So we can actually listen without walking over there and interrupting them. I'll show you that. And then another tool that we have is talk time, where we can actually see how much the students have talked at the touch of a button. So we touch the T key on the keyboard. If a student has talked a lot, they're in red. If they're kind of average talk time, they're yellow. And if they haven't spoken much, they're green. And I'll show you that tool. And that's really exciting for the professors to be able to see. The first time I saw that, I was really amazed. I thought, wow, I actually thought that person had talked way more than they did. Or, I actually hadn't realized this person was speaking as frequently as they were. It really made me aware of how most of my active learning classes were probably dominated by a fairly small percentage of the students in the brick and mortar. And I hadn't realized it because I thought, oh, that class went great. So much active discussion. But it was probably, if I was lucky in a 30-person class, maybe like 8 students really dominating that conversation. That would be a really good class, right? So, and you really don't have good feedback on that when you're in a traditional classroom. So talk time is really powerful. Okay, so I'm sure this is what you're waiting for. I'm going to show a video of the forum. And this is going to cover a couple of things: dashboard, breakout groups, and some of our engagement techniques that we use to facilitate fully active learning. Okay, so you can see all the students come on. They're on their individual laptops. This is our dashboard. And so this is how they learn about their pre-class work. Notice here that these are learning outcomes. So those are really emphasized and defined clearly. So it's not just what are we doing in class, but what are the outcomes that we want to attain. Every single class session has learning outcomes attached to it. That's something that we put them on our syllabi. They're there at the first page, but are they really in every class session? This is the outcome. I think at that level of detail in our lessons is really crucial. So this is how they enter class. And then polls are one way that we facilitate active learning, and you'll see in this one, there's a poll, and then there's a discussion, and then a re-poll, so they can see where they voted before the discussion and after, which is really useful.
This question again, same question as before. Okay, and here we are. We've changed a little bit, which is cool. So our first poll is on the left, and the second poll is on the right.
Let me just go back a tiny bit so you can also see the two comparison polls here. You can see they did change. I like this one because they moved quite a bit, actually. So it's nice. Up here is all of the students in thumbnail. So everyone's in the front row. There is no back row. Can't read your newspaper. It's really obvious if you're doing that. And then you can pull in students onto what we call the stage so that when they're being featured, if they're debating, if they're called on, or even if you might call on them and they want to expect that, they're in the center there.
My poll is on the right.
And this is our breakout groups.
And I will come around and answer questions, and then afterwards we will debrief it all together. Okay.
So one thing I want to mention too is on this slide, activity learning goal. What are we supposed to accomplish with this activity? That's really highlighted before they jump into the breakout groups.
I will see everyone in breakouts.
And this is our breakout control room. So this is what the professor sees. You can see what I was saying here. You can just listen if you want to, which means the students don't know you're listening. I mean, they know that you can listen. We disclose that. Surprisingly, I think they forget a lot. Lucas, you might have experienced this. Sometimes I'm listening and I'm like, guys, I can hear you, I'll pop in and be like, hello, I heard what you said. And so they need to be focused. One reason we might come in is if they're not focused on what they're meant to do. Here you can see they can raise their hand. So, the student has a question, I'm going to go into that group. They can work on shared documents in there, which is really valuable. And then you can visit if you want to, right? Also, there's a timer so you can see how much time is left and you can add time or subtract time as needed.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, Hoang. How are things going? Any questions yet?
So she's visiting. Okay.
That
Additional
probably
features.
makes
So this shows us that, again, they can collaborate on documents in the main classroom as well.
less of an important consideration.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So let's move on to our closure moment. So
I do want to mention that at the end of every activity, we have a closure moment, which means that we take a moment to review what we've just discussed and do they have any questions. This is something that we put into regular practice during the first year because we learned from students that as they were doing active learning, there was this idea that, from the professor's side, okay, I have to get through these 3 activities. And sometimes it would be, all right, we got to move on. But why are we moving on? And wait, I'm not ready to move on. And what should I know right now? What should I be thinking about right now? A lot of times active learning is disconcerting for the students because they don't know where they stand. They don't know, are they right? They don't know, are they wrong? We rely a lot on calling on students to explain a concept. Really important for the professor to take stock a couple of times during the class, right? Take a moment to say, okay, here's where we landed. Maybe we don't have a right answer or a wrong answer. It's a philosophy class where we're debating a topic. It's complex. But we can say, okay, what remaining questions do we still have? Let's talk about them in the next activity. So we make a nice transition and the students feel like they have a moment to reflect.
no single right answer. This is not a computational class where there's a single right answer. There's always many different ways of looking at this.
And you notice that was another poll, so they were able to see where they voted on maybe a complex issue that was not an easy answer.
You look at any slice through here, or if we compute the marginal over
This
x.
is a whiteboard.
So in the x direction,
So you can see
if we move this
faculty
way,
member can write on a
we'll
whiteboard.
always get.
They use iPads to do that, to make it a little easier to read. And you can also see they're working on coding here. So they, again, collaborate on many different types of work.
Thing that's symmetric.
And then this one is chat. So there's a chat function within the class. Students can type questions in chat, and they can like other chats. And so that's another way of getting input on how they're feeling about things. These are the professor tools. So talk time, as I discussed.
The result of
before.
a qualitative survey.
It's a nice display of what it looks like. So you can see where the students are in terms of their talk time. Again, red is, don't call on him, talked a lot. Professor is red. There's a couple of red students. And then yellow is average talk time. And green is go ahead and call on these students because they haven't spoken much. So we really do try to get in the voices of all the students as much as we can, which is really important. I think drawing out the Shire students, we talk a lot about how to do that in a way that gives them a voice but isn't so intimidating that they're terrified, right? So maybe you saw a chat message that they put in, or maybe they said something in the breakout and you can say, oh, can you elaborate on that? And then they're prepared, but they also do use their voice in the classroom, which I think is really crucial.
To develop a...
This is a timeline. So I can say this is like being an old timer, but when we first started teaching, we did not have the timeline, which meant that you had to pull in documents. Maybe there was a long list of them. You had to kind of know the flow of the class. It was all pretty manual. It was a huge benefit to add this timeline.
What do you think?
So you can see here, the class is all chunked into sections. That's a science of learning principle, chunking. A lot easier to retain if you organize information into chunks. And so this is kind of what the timeline is. For me, if I teach a class, I always know what the chunks are, right? Like this is a flow. I commit that to memory, and it's not hard to commit that to memory. And then I can see it in front of me. And so this is how we move through the classes, and that's all designed kind of on the back end for the instructors by the course designers. Sometimes the instructor is the course designer. Sometimes the instructor is not the course designer. So it's really valuable to have that timeline to click through when you're teaching. It reduces the cognitive load, and it allows you to focus on what the students are saying and doing, as opposed to like just having to navigate through the class. Really important.
To help when getting it onto a scale.
Okay, and then this last piece is after class. One of the things that I found when I was teaching brick and mortar was it was really hard to assess class participation. So raise your hand if you assess class participation in your classes. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you assess their participation?
Well, I just look, the class is all groups, so I just see who's active in the group, who's not. The groups are 2 or 3.
Yeah. Okay, so you can kind of look who's being active, who's speaking. If you're really diligent, you can make notes on that so that after class you don't forget. For me, I found that really hard to do. Like maybe I have another class I have to run to. Maybe I have to go pick up my kid at daycare, right? And then by the time I've done that and done all the 10 million things that I had to do after I picked up my kid at daycare, which is usually many things, I forgot what happened in class, right? So we have the video, and we can assess them on their participation using the video. The other benefit is that we can use our rubrics. So we can actually really do targeted outcomes-based assessment on in-class participation in a very consistent way because the class is recorded, and we have all the functionality and tools of grading written assignments also applied to the classroom.
I think, first of all, one of the things that can be done to solve that problem is to increase yields. By increasing yields.
So you see there's the student speaking. I can review what they said. I can tag a learning outcome to that exact comment, and then I can give them feedback. So I score them. I give them feedback on what was good about it and how they can improve. And then the student can review that after class. And also, yeah, you can see the distributions of how they did on specific learning outcomes across that class. And finally, this is the HC index. So this is our habits of mind and foundational concepts, which I said at the beginning was those are assessed throughout the 4 years. So in the first year, they're assessed throughout the courses as well. So like if assertions is introduced in complex systems, I can also assess that in multimodal communications or vice versa, right? So the students actually get kind of a outcome score that gets bucketed. So for each of the learning outcomes, all of their scores on that particular outcome get bucketed into one bucket, and then they can see that on their outcome index all the time. That's always accessible to them throughout their 4 years. And so they can see how they're performing on those outcomes over time, if they're improving, which ones they need to work on, which you can see as well. Oh, they can also see where they assessed on it in class, or where they assessed on it in an assignment, et cetera. So this is all valuable feedback for them. And I'll take questions shortly on all of that. I'm just going to close by talking about the model very quickly because I know I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. Okay, so so I'll just quickly say, as I mentioned, a lot of these courses are designed by designers, right? And so sometimes the instructor is a designer, sometimes not. They use a tool called Course Builder to design the lessons. And so you can see here, this is a page from Course Builder where you can see all the different courses, week to week, what the lessons are. It's really our learning management system, but again, very focused on outcomes-based approach to developing the lessons so we can really see which outcome is being measured and taught in each session. So that gives you an example of Course Builder. Overall, the model outside of the classroom, the students live in 7 different cities over their 4 years. So you can see San Francisco, Seoul and Hyderabad, Berlin, Buenos Aires, London, Taipei. So we have many different global experiences for them in different types of cities around the world. We don't have the infrastructure that a lot of campuses have that helps us keep our costs down. So we rent space for the students to live. We do have staff on the ground, but we don't have to maintain buildings and grounds and all those kinds of things. It's a lot of operational cost. And so this allows us to have about $30,000 a year all in. So that includes tuition, room, board, travel. We have 75% international students, very diverse, 60-40 male, female, and then 80% of our students are on financial aid. So again, access really important to us that if you qualify, you can come to Minerva. And this is just, these numbers really boggle my mind, I have to say. I can remember early on sort of having this conversation, well, we need to have 20,000 applications, and we were like, what? Really? And now we're past that, so that's pretty remarkable. Very difficult to get accepted, 1.2 admissions rate. I hear the students talking about this sometimes. Somebody will say something and they'll tease each other. Really, 1.2? It's pretty funny. I hear them teasing each other about that. But yeah, it's very challenging to get in. Our students are amazingly smart, talented students. We look at their accomplishments as part of the admissions process, grades. We don't do SATs. We have our own testing. So I think we get really remarkable students. Lucas could speak to that. And I'll end with a quote from one of our students who will graduate this year, Kiki. She said, "You can't change the world if you haven't seen the world." And so I'm really inspired to see how they change the world after they graduate in 2019. So I'm ready to take questions. Thanks so much for listening. Yes?
Wait for the mic. So, how do you know that the students actually learned anything overall from the 4 years? I mean, what's your metric for that?
That's a great
You
question.
keep talking about outcomes for class. What about the whole thing?
The whole thing, so on the skills or just overall on everything?
You tell me.
Yeah, so I mean, we can measure their progress on the habits of mind and foundational concepts throughout the 4 years. So we can see, are they increasing their mastery? Those rubrics remain the same over time and for every class in which they're assessed. So in terms of those foundational concepts, those HCs we introduced in the first year.
I mean, do you use standard instruments, or does the professor assess them on these things?
They're standard rubrics, so every professor uses the same rubric.
Okay.
Whether they're in their 4th year or their 1st year. So, and then we do spend a lot of time norming. We have an intensive training everybody who's teaching at Minerva has to go through in the 1st year. We talk a lot about HC assessment. We talk a lot about it in regular faculty meetings, right? I think it's a topic several times a year, so really like encouraging people to grade them and to grade them accurately. So, you know, there's always the human component, but we do really try to maintain consistency on those particular foundational concepts. So that's going to be one important metric. Another one that I can mention is already we've been working with employers. So we have a professional development agency. They place students with internships, and we've surveyed out all of the managers who've worked with our students. And how are they performing in the workplace? Because remember, back to the beginning of the talk, I talked about how we want to prepare them for that. And we've had extremely high ratings from the managers that we've surveyed already, even though they're not even graduating yet. So we'll continue to use those metrics. How are they actually applying what they've learned when they go into the work environment after they graduate, as much as we can. But right now we can already do that with our interns because we have relationships with those employers. So that's been another metric. So that's 2 at least that I can mention. Yeah. How about, well, I'll let you choose, Ryan.
Okay.
At the beginning, you mentioned the 96% from the administrators and 11 from the employers.
Yes.
In terms of the skills gained.
Yeah, right.
Could you talk a little bit more about the gap? What kinds of skills? What skills are perceived as
lacking?
Not learned? Yes.
Yeah, I think critical thinking skills is one. So students not being able to sort of process what's in front of them. Problem solving. I mean, I have 2 children that are getting into the teen years, and I'm always saying to them, okay, solve the problem, right? Because mom, where's this? What, I need to do this, right? Like, okay, you need to solve that problem. How can you solve it on your own? I also see this a lot when I work with students, right? Like, they want you to guide them. They want you to tell them what to do, and really, again, teaching them how to fish, right? Like, how are you going to solve that? And then we can talk about the solution that you devised and whether it's effective or there might be another effective one. So problem-solving skills are another gap. So those are two good examples, I think, where they're not really prepared for those kinds of ways of independent thinking and operating, being able to be relied on to take initiative. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
can I answer that?
Yeah, please.
About content and abilities.
Yes.
There's a big difference. I'm teaching.
Oh, yeah. Use the mic. There's a video. I think that's why we want it.
So I'm in computational science, so I'm teaching courses in math, and we want students to develop knowledge of content, but more than that, we want them to be able to apply that content in as many real-world scenarios as possible. So I think that one way that we do that is planning our curriculum in a way that applies the content as much as possible, rather than just testing them, oh, can you repeat this operation 100 times?
Yep.
We don't care so much about that, but rather, can you apply this concept into a real-world problem?
Yeah, and that's one of our learning principles that we taught. If you've read the book, the Minerva book, there's a chapter on science of learning. Principles, not rote, right? So the students can often memorize, different variations of a problem, but actually knowing how to apply something in their toolkit to a real-world problem and situation is really important, which is why we focus so much on transfer. Because once they get out there and are operating on their own, they're not going to have like an assignment in front of them. They're actually going to have to think, how do I take a tool from my toolkit of all the things I've learned and apply it? I've got to pull that out. I have to know that myself. So that's really important for them to really have a grasp on the principles and be able to apply them in many contexts. Yeah, there's a question in the back.
I came in a little late, so you might have covered this.
Yeah.
But I didn't hear anything about how the students themselves are involved in the actual creation of the learning environment which they are in, so that they can have ownership of it and that they are a part of it, rather than, you know, one of the big things in globalization is do we just work for the global marketplace and put in hours and get money out of it, or do we actually try to understand the global marketplace? We need to do both. We have to understand it. We have to understand the world that it is creating. So in order to do that, we need two. We need to be able to obviously economically survive in it, but also we have to be able to restructure it, you know, if it's not working.
Yeah, so I can say a few things. Thank you. That's a great question on how we've engaged them in building out this model. The first class, I think, has had incredible influence because they've been the first ones to go through the program. And so giving us feedback on everything, I think they are not shy about giving feedback. Maybe Lucas can speak to that. But of course, we give them surveys on every class session, and also they regularly come to us with, you know, this isn't working, this is working. So lots of feedback from the students on every aspect of their experience. I think also they do some, for example, they do location-based assignments that are pretty broad in all of our classes, and then they go out into the city and learn things about their environment and then bring that into their assignment. So that's, I think, one way they really shape the curriculum of the course, not so much in the lesson plan for the day, but actually bringing in the experience they're having in the different cities into the conversations from the classes and into their assignments and working with one another. And there's outside of the classroom ways, too, that they, in terms of the overall model, we have student experience teams on the ground in every city, and they facilitate relationships between the students and civic partners. But the students take initiative there, and often in the first year, for example, they do a final project. All of the students have a final project in the Cornerstone Courses where they're going out into the city and they're working with a partner. For example, I had a student who was working with a clinic that was working on outcomes for women in childbirth. And so really trying to look at, you know, prenatal care and the systems in place to facilitate prenatal care, give access to prenatal care to people in the city. What were the problems with that? And they made recommendations on how to improve based on what they were learning in complex systems and other courses. So I think that's a way that they take the Minerva curriculum and apply it in real world contexts and really develop knowledge in a practical way, hands-on way. Fridays, we don't have classes, and they're really meant to be doing co-curriculars and getting out there and working with civic partners. So to your point, you know, shaping the world and really going out there and being active in problem solving as part of their education. And I think the students really shape that because they choose what they're going to work on. They choose which partners to work with. Sometimes they've even built relationships themselves with partners. So I think that's another way that they really shape the model. I don't know if you have anything to add there. But. Oh, yes. Yeah, so that's great. So in the fourth year, the students take tutorials, which are small classes led by an instructor, like maybe between 3 to 5. Our average tutorial size is 5 students. And they, this year, completely came up with all of the topics on their own. Next year, we're going to do a combination of maybe repeating some of the successful ones and then still allowing them to propose an independent topic as well. And so that's another way. In the senior year, they shape their the curriculum is in the tutorials, and everybody does a capstone project at the end too. So they all have to do an independent project that synthesizes everything they've learned and launches them into a new career path. So the fourth year is really quite self-designed as well. So yeah, thanks.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
You described a lot about what the sort of classroom environment is like, to the extent you would call it a classroom. Can you share more about what life outside the classroom is like for the
Sure.
students, how it's sort of similar or different from what life in different universities would be like?
That is a great question. And I wish I had some students here because they obviously could speak to that even better than I could. But talking with them, I think it's challenging. I mean, they come from all over the world, so they're living with people from all kinds of backgrounds, and it's wonderful and hard, right? So they have to learn how to get along with each other. They have to learn about each other. They sometimes disagree. And so that's a big challenge, but I think such an important part of them developing this kind of global sensibility is just that 4-year journey with your cohort of about 160 students become very close to one another, and they are really from very, very different backgrounds, which I think is crucial.
Sort of day in the life.
Yeah. We actually have, right.
The athletics, do they go to dining
Got it.
halls? Do they,
Just like the basics, yeah. So they live together. They take their classes on Minerva Forum. We don't have all the varsity athletics, but they do have clubs. So they many times and they've started those clubs. That's another way that the students take a lot of initiative. They're all student design. Minerva, they're called MECOs. I think they stand for Minerva curriculars or co-curriculars. Anyway, MECOs is the abbreviation. So they've started a lot of the club activities, and they range from music to coding to, we have a group of students that do hackathons, and they're really good. They win a lot of the hackathons. We had a group of students who did a physics competition as coached by a faculty member. That was something they took initiative to do. So it's a pretty wide range of interests they have. Some of them do outdoors things. They go hiking in different cities. They go explore different locations, the natural realm around the cities. So if they're interested in that, environmentalism or just being outdoors. So there's a wide range of activities that they self-organize, and we do help them facilitate that, but is different from what the student experience teams do in terms of designing and focusing on partners in the cities. Like the MECOs are really their chance to organize the things they want to do. And so I think to be a Minerva student, you need to take a lot of initiative. It's really not handed to you on a platter. That's one big difference, I would say, from a lot of other universities. And that's challenging, but also they learn a lot from doing that. I think adapting to 7 cities is really challenging. That's one thing we are looking at, and really once we have this graduating class, like how was it to go to 7 cities? What did you gain? What was difficult? How can we equip them to adapt that way? Because if they don't hit the ground running when they get there, then they lose out. And I've talked to many students who feel that that's something they learned. They really have to engage right away in order to make the most out of a city and not be a tourist. So that's pretty different from a brick and mortar, for sure. But then I think, they have social interactions, and they're dating, and they're, all the things that you see on other campuses also happening in that way too, with their interacting with one another. I don't really know whether they're dating, but I assume they are. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
If I can indulge, I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
First of all, can you explain the Minerva's relationship to KGI? And
Sure.
Also, given some of the statistics that you said at the beginning about the sort of massive world change needed for skills development, does Minerva have some ideas of scaling this beyond 1.2 acceptance rates to larger numbers of students? Thanks.
Excellent. Both great questions. So our relationship to KGI is they're our partner, and they offer, when we got accreditation, we partnered with KGI. So we were accredited from the beginning when we admitted our first class. And that's one vehicle that you can use to get accreditation, is to partner with another institution and incubate with them. And so KGI is our partner institution. They're very much aligned with Minerva in many ways in terms of applied learning. And so our students can actually use the labs there in the summers if they want to, so we have those kinds of arrangements with them. And they also have some classes on our Minerva Forum. So it's a great relationship, and Shelley Schuster is very involved with as the president of KGI with oversight at Minerva for hiring and those kinds of things. So that's our relationship. We're kind of incubating and offering primarily undergraduate programs for KGI, and we do have one small master's program that we're offering that's quite different from their graduate study. And they are a graduate institution, so it's Keck Graduate Institute. So hopefully that answers that question. And then the second question was, remind me, how are we expanding beyond the 1.2, right? So we are actually starting to partner with other universities to offer the use of both the Minerva Forum and Minerva Pedagogy. So we have one example now that we're doing with Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, where their students are taking our cornerstones. And we expect to be doing some more partnerships in the near future, where it will allow students to have access to, again, the pedagogy and the tools that we have, but broaden out beyond our small group of students that we admit to Minerva. Yeah. Oh, the mic is back here. Sorry.
Sorry. So a big part of the undergraduate experience here and for a lot of students in science and technology is the ability to do undergraduate research.
Yes.
You can't go to grad school if you haven't done undergraduate research. A lot of companies, when they're going to hire, the first question they have in their interview is, tell me about the projects that you've worked on and stuff like that. And that really requires facilities and things and stuff, right? Does the Minerva model allow for that sort of thing? Do you partner with institutions to get that sort of access? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a question that we get a lot. And yes, we do have relationships in the cities with different institutions. I know Dean Vicki Chandler is, she's a geneticist, so she's in the sciences. She's our chief academic officer. She was dean of natural sciences before that. Built a lot of relationships in different locations to help facilitate research for students. So they can do kind of research projects and internships while on the ground in the different cities. They also have the summers. We have students working with faculty as research assistants. So we definitely have facilitated that. And then again, KGI is another place where KGI does a lot of work in bioscience. And so they have access to those facilities as well. So yes, we do facilitate opportunities for our students to do research. Yeah.
So officially we are out of time. I'm sure Kara would be happy to take a few more questions,
Absolutely.
but for those of you who need to go, and Ryan, I believe we have the room, is that correct? We do. So the room is available if people want to linger and continue to discuss, but officially I wanted to thank Kara and thank the audience for coming out today. Thanks so much, Kara, for sharing about Minerva Schools with us today.
Thank you.